I will begin. We decided to begin and end this panel, as I mentioned before, with these excerpts from Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's Great Mass in C, Kerschel number 427, which means it's his 427th work that he wrote, and he still had a good number of years before he died at the age of 37. Because this work is perhaps, performing it, is perhaps the most efficient way, in view of the wide diversity of experience of the people who are gathered here, to report on, and I hope, recruit you into a voyage of rediscovery. Lyndon LaRouche has spearheaded this voyage, whose purpose is to rediscover the lost art of classical musical composition. With the aid of the certain musical scores to guide our way, which you'll see, I'll describe, and also playing those examples at the same time, with the orchestra and the chorus's help, I'll describe some leading features of a musical revolution which was sparked by Mozart during the years 1782 through 1786, i.e. beginning exactly 210 years ago. This revolution created the context for the emergence of the classical medium of musical composition and the outstanding work of Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Brahms, and a few other composers during the century following Mozart's life. And I can say with certainty that anyone today who's really serious about organizing his fellow man to become more perfectly in the image of his creator must understand what this musical revolution is all about, if we are going to generate future generations of Mozarts, Beethovens, and scientists of the same caliber and creative people of the same caliber. Unfortunately, in our own century, which is now lurching to its end, knowledge of the method by which these great classical works were composed has been all but buried underneath an avalanche of banality and romanticism, which amount to about the same thing. Why don't you let your hair down? Just let all those animal emotions out for a while. That's the leering message pounded out by a mass media intent on keeping viewers in a state of, and listeners, in a state of perpetual moral and mental turpitude. And if you're offended by the hardcore, I want your sex variety of rock, well, marketing adjustments can always be made to suit your particular set of fixed beliefs. For instance, instead of I want your sex, the words I love Jesus can be substituted over the identical, mind-numbing, repetitive rock beat, producing a zombie-like state which is no better, and in some respects far worse, than that which afflicts the pornographic pothead or the cocaine-sniffing yuppie. But let's have none of that tonight, or any time. Amen. Great classical musical polyphony. Polyphony meaning many voices, polyphony. Whether explicitly religious, as in the case of the sung mass that we're listening to tonight, or of a more secular nature, is dedicated exclusively to celebrating, uplifting, exercising, and improving that part of us which uniquely makes us human, that divine spark of reason within each human individual, which has enabled humanity through successive scientific revolutions, cultural revolutions as well, which is the same thing again, to organize our universe. Great classical music is the food for kindling that spark. As Nicholas of Cusa put it in his 1463 essay on the hunt for wisdom, and I quote, "We are roused by an appetite placed in our nature not only for knowledge of things, but also for possessing wisdom or tasteful knowledge. Since our intellectual nature lives, it must necessarily be nourished. But similar to the manner in which every living being is nourished through the food which is appropriate to its life, it cannot at all be refreshed by any other food than that of intelligible life. For because the vital spirit moves delectably, which motion is called life, the power of the spirit of life, unless it is restored through its natural refreshment, becomes weak and expires." Unquote. Now, a certain amount of review is going to be necessary tonight in order to properly situate what I'm going to say about Mozart's musical revolution. All classical polyphony is based on bel canto, multi-voiced singing of classical poetry. Bel canto meaning beautiful song. We'll get more into that later. While classical spoken poetry, as we heard on the stage here, in the case of the Schiller, is immersed in the use of metaphor, as we discussed in the preceding panel, singing must also be performed according to the principles of bel canto that were discovered in the 15th century Florentine Renaissance by circles associated with Filippo Brunelleschi, builder of the dome over the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral in Florence. And these breakthroughs in singing, kind of breakthrough in singing technology, developed by such co-thinkers of Brunelleschi as the Flemish composer Guillaume Dufay, was celebrated in a set of sculptures, which Nora showed you a brief shot of earlier on, fashioned by Luca della Robbia for the new cathedral's choir loft. And I'd like you to see the first slide there, if you can. Yes, or both at the same time, like that. Huh. How do I get do you focus it? Yeah, okay. Now, it's a little bit difficult to see in this, but if you look closely, and if you look at the cover of the music manual, you will see this same picture there. Examine the rounded position of the boy's mouth. These are youths singing in puberty, or just some before puberty, some after, and at the same time, they're making a very evident effort to elevate the tone that they are producing into the higher resonating cavities of the head. This is quite unlike our 20th century crooners. Right? Hello, I can sing a song for you. You know, you don't need to project the sound at all if you have a microphone like that. Or, of course, the screamers, and I'm not going to scream. But that's the other end of the spectrum. But what we're talking about here is a breakthrough in terms of a round sound. And indeed, these sculptures, if you examine them, are so carefully done that you can identify in them not only the general quality of the sound that these singers are producing, but also even the specific voice species of each voice. That is, whether they're a soprano, they're singing a soprano or mezzo-soprano, or a tenor or a bass. And you can even find the specific register or part of their vocal range in which each voice is singing. Over the 3.5 centuries extending from this breakthrough, the time of this breakthrough in the Florentine Renaissance, up to Mozart's time, knowledge of these voice species and registers was considerably refined, as is discussed at great length in Book 1 of the Manual on Tuning and Registration. In case you haven't seen this, our manual here. I'll summarily now present those species and registers and confine myself to only mentioning those aspects which will be essential for us later on. Can I have the first overhead, please? Can you bring the projector closer so we can get, yes. Oh, okay. It's going to need to be closer because I'm going to have musical examples which will fill up the screen as well. Mm-hmm. Okay. Ah. Yes, I think we've got it now. Good. This is also in the inside cover of the music manual. All human beings capable of vocalization fall into one of the 6 categories of singing voice indicated here. You see the piano keyboard on the top, and then coming down, the not just the ranges of the 6 voices, which are soprano, mezzo-soprano, contralto, tenor, baritone, and bass in the bottom. But you also see they're divided up into different registers. The register is indicated by different color, the lowest register being in red, which is the lower or chest register, in yellow, the central register, in blue, the head or high register, and then in the case of the soprano and the tenor, you have in violet the so-called super high register. This doesn't, no, that doesn't work. It doesn't show on the white. Yeah. The soprano voice, the most universal of these species is the soprano voice, the top one. Soprano voice is uniquely distinguished not by simply the range of tones at its command, which is variable, but by its invariable set of register shifts. Namely, all sopranos' voices shift naturally if they sing naturally with the bel canto approach, from their low or chest register to the central register precisely at between the F and the F sharp above middle C, as is pointed there. And they also shift naturally from the central register to their high or head register at a location precisely 1 octave higher than that. Now, I should qualify my use of the word naturally in what I just said. The soprano voice will always behave so, provided that he or she, he in the case of the boy soprano, sings at the natural or scientific tuning, which assigns to middle C, which you can point out there, middle of the piano, a value of approximately 256 cycles per second, as opposed to the modern arbitrarily unnaturally high tuning of A equals 440 cycles. The effort of our philosophical association to jolt the modern musical world towards sanity by readopting the natural C256 tuning as the universal standard is quite well known by now around the world. Suffice it to say that thanks in large part to our movement, we can see the hegemony of the high tuning under attack everywhere, and the publication of Book 1 of the Music Manual and its circulation to all of the world's leading musicians and musical institutions may be just what is required to defeat it once and for all. Now, returning to our register chart, we can see that each of the other species of singing voice is uniquely defined by its own set of register shifts. Each voice, in other words, has its own unique spectroscopy, a signature just as telling and just as identifiable as the absorption spectra of the elements of the periodic table of elements. Not only does this permit us to identify each voice species, but it also provides the composer with the rudimentary basis for creating musical change. That is, the substance of classical music is emphatically not the transmission of titillating stimuli to our senses, as the Romantics claim, nor is its substance the nostalgic evocation of any one of a variety of maudlin soap opera style feeling states. That was a trick pioneered by such romantic musical pornographers as Richard Wagner. No. The sense impressions of music are but a means by which we can identify poetic ironies, ambiguities, or dissonances, is the musical term, as they are produced by juxtapositions of the register shifts within individual voices and between voices of differing species. To put it another way, the substance of classical polyphony lies between the notes. And yet, in order for this silent music to be recognized and understood, its substance must also be clothed in the garb of beautiful and well-tuned bel canto vocalization. To see how this works in practice, we're going to take an example from the Mozart piece that we just heard, and we'll hear it again, and we'll hear that again later, of course. But first, let's examine how the C scale is divided by the registers of the soprano voice. May I have the next overhead? Observe that the scale, starting from the middle C at the bottom there, on the left-hand side going up, that it's divided precisely in half with a discontinuity or a register shift precisely between the F and the F sharp there. Now, I'd like some of our sopranos to simply sing the scale upwards and downwards. We can have our soprano section here do it as a whole. I think it might be good so that you can hear the shift between the heavier first register and the lighter second register. And the sopranos can just rise, and we can. Okay, let's do it on no, and then nu. What's the a little bit. That's a little bit. Listen. Here we go. Okay. So it's no, and then nu. Okay. Ready? Now it shifts. Back down. There it shifts back down. Thank you. Now, let's examine the following poetic line. It's like a line of poetry from the end of the Kyrie that we heard at the beginning. Can I have the next overhead? The yellow is the second register and the red is the first register. The first register shift down from the G at the beginning down to the E flat highlights in a descending direction the C minor key of this piece. The next two measures seem to state and then repeat in an identical pattern, but in fact they're anything but identical. Right? What I'm talking about here is the Kyrie, that moves down, and then eleison, eleison. That seems to repeat the same pattern. But in fact, it's anything but identical. Notice, because the first little figure with that's the barred notes there, which is the fast 16th notes, are entirely in the soprano's first register, whereas the second one shifts register at the dissonant F sharp. Point out the F sharp there, maybe. Other side. Yeah, there it is. I'd use this laser, but it just doesn't. I don't think it. No, it doesn't carry. Okay. I'd like the sopranos now to sing this line. I'll give you. Okay. Okay. 3, 4, 1. listen for the shift. It'll come right now. Thank you. Therefore, the composer's intent, Mozart's intent in presenting this line is not to have the listener merely sit back and passively enjoy its undeniable beauty. Rather, the composer has used this shift to a higher register to create a difference or ambiguity in the listener's mind, thus inviting you to actively participate in the work of creative problem solving about to unfold in the piece. Thus, this elementary difference of contrasting registration is the natural God-given characteristic whose introduction in this way permits the composer to construct an ordering principle that will now unfold through a succession of increasingly complex paradoxes and ambiguities. Each individual act of discovery governing the necessity of these ambiguities is what Lyndon LaRouche terms a musical thought object. The shift is shown here in a single voice, in the soprano voice. We have three other voices singing as well in this particular passage, and in this case the placement of all of the voices, various register shifts, serves to enrich the particular musical thought object Mozart is pointing to in this work. Can I have the next figure? Before we sing it, I just want you to note especially the bass line, which is descending from the C in the beginning there, and it's moving downwards in half-step motion. And but there's a leap at the very end where it goes Kyrie da da dum. No, excuse me. Da 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 dum. So there's a shift there, and also there's there's a leap which happens at the. Could I have just the basses, please? Sing the opening line there. Have the figure? It's at the end of the Kyrie. Yeah. Okay, got it? Okay. Ready? That shift there, Kyrie, is a register shift as well, which is shown at the bottom there when it moves from the red to the yellow. He contrasts that with the bass instrumental line below it, where there isn't any such shift. So Mozart has the human basses do a kind of transposition when they're jumping like that. Kyrie, it's called an octave transposition upwards before dropping down to the G. Kyrie, that's an A, G, which is their register shift there. Meanwhile, the tenors echo this process in their own by their own octave leap into their second register on the middle C. I'll point that you'll hear that pretty well there. Kyrie, when they move there. And I'd like the whole chorus just to sing this little section here with the orchestral basses. Okay? Do you have a measure number? 86? Measure 86? Okay. we're now in a position to, this is a quick review clearly, but we want to move on and consider the man-made musical instruments for a moment here, which comprise the classical orchestral ensemble. The development of man-made musical instruments capable of imitating the human bel canto trained vocal choir enables us to tremendously enrich and extend our ability to create such ironies without ever violating the fundamental spectroscopy of the human singing voices. With the aid of such instruments tuned at C256, we're able to accomplish a number of objectives. For example, we can imitate the spectroscopy of the human voice types on these instruments. We can also transpose the spectroscopy of the human voices to other intervals. For example, the interval of 1 octave, as we saw. Well, you have the idea of this is one voice just moving an octave into the other register. But you can, let's take the example of the woodwind instruments, the flute, the clarinet, the oboe, bassoon. The specific registral spectroscopy of the woodwinds actually differs from those of any human voice singing the same notes. Can I have the next chart? I don't want to go in the details, but the first register goes up in the flute and the oboe. At the top one, it goes up much higher than the soprano's first register, and the second register also is much higher. It changes at a different place between the C sharp and the D, as opposed to between the F and the F sharp in the soprano. Composers in the classical tradition of Mozart and Beethoven discovered, however, how to turn these differences to their compositional advantage in a number of ways. For instance, they used the different registration as a means of creating a new paradox, dissonance, or ambiguity with respect to the human singing voice. Or they frequently have the instrument play the notes of a human vocal line transposed upward or downwards by 1 octave in order to achieve registral clarity. May I have the next overhead? Here, for instance, is an example taken from the Gloria section, which you haven't heard yet, of Mozart's Mass. And I'd like the altos to sing, turn to the Gloria and sing measures 10 to 12. Ready, alto? Okay. I'm getting a little bit loud. Okay. Ready? Go. Okay. Keep standing. So the mezzo-sopranos have to sing this entire line in their central register, but the lowest notes at the very end of that line, in excelsis, fall at the very bottom of that register, and therefore it's difficult for them, they can't sing the same caliber. Unfortunately, in our own century, which is now lurching to its end, knowledge of the method by which these great classical works were composed has been all but buried underneath an avalanche of banality and romanticism, which amount to about the same thing. Why don't you let your hair down? Just let all those animal emotions out for a while. That's the leering message pounded out by a mass media intent on keeping viewers in a state of, and listeners, in a state of perpetual moral and mental turpitude. And if you're offended by the hardcore, I want your sex variety of rock, well, marketing adjustments can always be made to suit your particular set of fixed beliefs. For instance, instead of I want your sex, the words I love Jesus can be substituted over the identical, mind-numbing, repetitive rock beat, producing a zombie-like state which is no better, and in some respects far worse, than that which afflicts the pornographic pothead or the cocaine-sniffing yuppie. But let's have none of that tonight, or any time. Amen. classical medium of musical composition and the outstanding work of Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Brahms, and a few other composers during the century following Mozart's life. And I can say with certainty that anyone today who's really serious about organizing his fellow man to become more perfectly in the image of his creator must understand what this musical revolution is all about. If we are going to generate future generations of Mozarts, Beethovens, and scientists of the same caliber and creative people, to a voyage of rediscovery. Lyndon LaRouche has spearheaded this voyage, whose purpose is to rediscover the lost art of classical musical composition. With the aid of the certain musical scores to guide our way, which you'll see, I'll describe, and also playing those examples at the same time with the orchestra and the chorus's help, I'll describe some leading features of a musical revolution which was sparked by Mozart during the years 1782 through 1786, i.e. beginning exactly 210 years ago. This revolution created the context for the emergence of the... I will begin. We decided to begin and end this panel, as I mentioned before, with these excerpts from Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's Great Mass in C, Kerschel number 427, which means it's his 427th work that he wrote, and he still had a good number of years before he died at the age of 37. Because this work is perhaps, performing it, is perhaps the most efficient way, in view of the wide diversity of experience of the people who are gathered here, to report on, and I hope, recruit you into